What would you do if the very people you gave everything to, your love, your time, your money, turned around and made you feel like a stranger at your own daughter's wedding? What if, after years of sacrifice and support, they decided you were nothing more than a checkbook and a placeholder? This isn't just a story about a wedding. This is about betrayal in its quietest form, the kind that doesn't come with screaming matches or slammed doors, but with forced smiles, cold shoulders, and the unmistakable sting of being deliberately excluded. This is the story of a mother who watched her only daughter slip away, a woman who sat through planning meetings, wrote check after check, and poured herself into making sure her little girl had the perfect day, only to be seated in the aisle like she didn't belong, like she wasn't family anymore. But I didn't stay seated. I stood up. And then I walked away. What followed wasn't just a canceled reception, it was a reckoning. So join me. Hit the subscription button for more stories you can connect with. Tell me if you've ever had to walk away from something that once meant everything. I didn't even know the wedding was happening until the announcement showed up on Facebook. That's how I found out, through a screen. A picture of her hand, the ring I knew she couldn't afford on her own, and the caption, "Can't wait to marry my best friend." No call, no visit. Just an image carefully filtered and cropped, shared with the world before it was ever shared with me. My daughter. My only child. At first I told myself it was an oversight, that maybe she was just excited, caught up in the moment, that the call would come later. It didn't. Days passed, then weeks, and all I heard was silence. It wasn't until I reached out that she finally responded. A text, not a call, not even a voice, just a message with 3 lines. "Hey Mom, sorry I didn't tell you sooner. Things have been crazy. The wedding's in June. No, I miss you. No, I'd love for you to be part of it. Just logistics. Like I was some distant relative being notified out of obligation." I stared at that message for hours. My hands shook as I read it, over and over, hoping I had missed something. Some sign of affection, some warmth. But it wasn't there. It was cold, detached, clinical. And it gutted me. I raised her on my own. Her father walked out before she turned 5, and it was me, just me, working double shifts, skipping meals, saying no to new clothes for myself so she could have what she needed. I never took vacations. I never dated seriously. My life was about her. Every single choice I made revolved around that girl. And now, at the most important moment in her life, I was a footnote, a +1 to her future. Still, I showed up. Of course I did. I told myself I had to. That maybe if I got involved, if I offered to help, she'd remember who I was to her. So I asked how I could support. She replied with a shopping list. There was no thank you, no real conversation, just numbers, amounts, deadlines. I became a silent investor in a production I wasn't even invited to co-direct. I swallowed my pride, wrote the checks, smiled when she sent me links to centerpieces and catering options. She included me, but only when it came to spending. Never for decisions. Never for moments that mattered. And then came the final blow. The seating chart. I had asked just once where I'd be sitting during the ceremony. I imagined I'd be in the front, beside her. Her mother. The one who had tucked her into bed for 18 years. The one who stayed up during fevers, who read every school permission slip, who kept every art project like it was a masterpiece. But when I arrived for the rehearsal and asked about my seat, her maid of honor laughed. "Oh, you're in the aisle row on the side," she said, "behind the groom's uncle and his wife." I stared at her. I thought she was joking. I looked at my daughter. She avoided my eyes. She heard it. She didn't correct it. She didn't even flinch. They sat me in the aisle, not in the front, not with her. In the aisle, like I was some ex-wife who had been invited out of guilt. I stood there in silence, while laughter bubbled around me. No one noticed the way my heart was splintering. No one cared. I was background noise, a shadow at my own daughter's wedding. That night, I couldn't sleep. I stared at the ceiling, every moment from her childhood playing like a movie on loop. Her first steps, her first heartbreak, the day she graduated and turned to look for me in the crowd. Where did that girl go? And more importantly, what happened to me? I had let myself be reduced to a wallet with a pulse. I had allowed her and everyone around her to rewrite who I was. Not anymore. So the morning of the wedding, I packed my bag, called the venue, and canceled the catering. Canceled the flowers, pulled the payment on the photographer. All of it. Every contract was in my name. Every invoice tied to my account. If they didn't want a mother, they wouldn't get a benefactor either. And then I walked out the door. No note. No goodbye. Just silence. Let them feel what I had felt all along. Invisible. Unwanted. Forgotten. I didn't turn off my phone when I left. I wanted to hear the fallout. I wanted to feel every vibration, every ring, every voicemail that would come pouring in once they realized what I had done. That for once, I had taken control. That I had finally said no. But as the hours passed and my phone remained silent, it hit me harder than any scream or insult ever could. They didn't call. Not once. Not her. Not the groom. Not even one of her bridesmaids trying to smooth things over. That silence was deafening. It wasn't until almost midnight, long after the ceremony was supposed to have started, that the first text came through. From her, of course. Just one line. "What the hell did you do?" No mom, no punctuation, no question mark. Just flat, angry text, like I was a stranger who had ruined her brunch, not the woman who had paid for every inch of her fantasy and been shoved into the margins of it. I stared at the screen for a long time, my thumb hovering over the reply button. I could have explained. I could have said I felt hurt, humiliated, discarded. I could have told her that watching her look through me like I wasn't even part of her life had broken something in me that could never quite be fixed again. But I didn't. Instead, I turned the phone off. Because I owed her nothing, not anymore. The days that followed were strange, quiet. I kept expecting someone to show up on my doorstep. Her fiancé, his mother, a friend maybe. But no one came. They weren't interested in my side of the story. They weren't interested in me. What they wanted was a villain. Someone to blame. And I had given them exactly that. They didn't know that the catering company had been 2 hours from loading up the trucks when I made the call. That the florist had just finished binding the bouquets when I told her to stop the order. That the photographer, a young woman I'd personally chosen and paid a deposit for, had thanked me. Yes, thanked me for letting her spend the weekend with her sick father instead. What they didn't know, what they never even asked, was that I hadn't done it out of spite. I did it because I had finally opened my eyes. This wasn't about a wedding. This was about a daughter who had outgrown her mother like an old coat. Something she wore for years until it was no longer flattering. And when it no longer fit, she tossed it aside without even bothering to fold it. She had erased me from her life long before the aisle seat. I just didn't want to believe it. I wanted to believe that she still saw me. That deep down, I still mattered. That all the sacrifices, every skipped vacation, every unpaid bill, every time I stayed up past midnight to finish a work report after helping her with a school project, meant something. That I hadn't been invisible all along. But the moment I stood at that rehearsal, listening to strangers tell me where I was allowed to sit, something in me snapped. I realized I was not part of this life she was building. I was a footnote, a funding source, And now I was finally free. Free from the guilt. Free from the one-sided love. Free from pretending that proximity meant closeness. The next time my phone rang, it was a number I didn't recognize. I almost didn't answer, but curiosity won out. It was the venue manager. "I just wanted to let you know," she said cautiously. "They're threatening legal action." Of course they were. That was the next logical step. If emotional manipulation didn't work, hit back with something colder. Something that left a paper trail. "They won't win," I said calmly. "The contracts are all under my name, paid with my money. Nothing's owed. Nothing was delivered. I canceled within the legal window." She hesitated. "I figured. I just thought you'd want to know." I thanked her, then hung up. I didn't cry. I didn't feel triumphant either. I just felt empty. Because no matter how right it had been to leave, it still hurt like hell to realize the person I loved most in this world hadn't loved me back. Not in the way I needed. And now the dust was settling, and I was standing in the wreckage, alone. But I'd rather be alone in truth than surrounded by people who only loved what I gave them, not who I was. I didn't leave the house for 3 days, not because I was hiding, not because I was ashamed, but because I was exhausted in a way I didn't know existed. Not the kind of exhaustion that sleep fixes. This was different. This was soul deep. Like I had spent the last 25 years pouring myself out cup by cup, and the jug was finally dry. The blinds stayed closed, the phone stayed off, and I just existed. I made tea I didn't drink. I sat in rooms I barely remembered decorating. And I waited. For what? I wasn't sure. Maybe for the guilt to set in. Maybe for the panic to catch up with me. Maybe for someone, anyone, to knock on the door and ask if I was okay. But no one did. It was strange how loud silence can be when you're alone with it. Every tick of the clock, every creak of the floorboards felt like a taunt. Like the house was mocking me. "This is what you chose," it whispered. "This is the cost of walking away." But I didn't regret it. Not for a second. I regretted needing to do it, sure. Regretted that it had come to this. That my only option left, the only move I had, was to pull the pin on everything and watch the whole thing go up in flames. But not the action itself. That, I'd do again. On the 4th day, the doorbell rang. I knew it wasn't her. She would never show up here. Not unless she was ready to make it about her. Not unless she could turn it into a dramatic scene where I was the cruel mother who ruined her wedding and refused to apologize. But this ring, this was different. It was too soft. Too hesitant. I opened the door and found her fiancé standing there. Well, ex, maybe. That part wasn't clear yet. He looked uncomfortable, shifting on his feet like a boy caught in the wrong house. His tie was loose. His hair looked like he hadn't slept. For a brief second, I saw the man my daughter had chosen and wondered if he even knew what he'd gotten himself into. "Hi," he said, voice awkward and forced. "Can I come in?" I didn't answer. I just stepped aside. He followed me into the living room and sat on the edge of the couch like it might bite him. I stayed standing. I didn't want to sit. Sitting felt too casual, too open. "I'm not here to fight," he said quickly, like he had rehearsed it. I wanted to talk." I folded my arms, waited. "She's really upset," he started, like I didn't know that already. "She's been crying nonstop. She's blaming herself but also blaming you, and honestly, I think she doesn't know what to feel. None of us do." "Then maybe you shouldn't be here," I said, my voice quieter than I expected. "If you're confused about where your loyalties lie, this isn't the place to sort that out." He winced at that. Look, I get it. I really do. I saw how she treated you. I saw it happen in real time. You were sidelined, dismissed, and you deserved better. You were right to walk away. I hadn't expected that. For a moment, I forgot how to breathe. I told her that, he added. After everything went down, after the calls started coming in from vendors and photographers, I told her she'd pushed you too far. I sat down then, not because I was tired, but because something in my chest cracked, and I needed a place to land. She doesn't know how to face you, he continued. She's always been stubborn. She doesn't like being wrong. And now she's afraid that maybe this time, she really is. I stared at him, trying to find the thread of manipulation, the angle. But there wasn't one. He wasn't trying to fix things. He wasn't asking me to make anything right. He was just here, with honesty, with discomfort, with silence that felt like something real instead of something forced. I don't know what's going to happen next, he admitted. But I thought you deserved to hear from someone that you weren't crazy. You were justified. And then he stood up, as awkwardly as he had arrived. Thank you, I said softly. 2 words I hadn't used in a long time. 2 words I hadn't meant in even longer. He nodded and left without another word. And I sat there, for a long time, in the middle of the quiet wreckage, realizing that maybe, just maybe, I wasn't the villain of this story. Maybe I had finally stopped playing the victim too. The silence after he left was different. Not heavier, not lighter, just different, like something had shifted, just slightly. The walls of the house weren't so suffocating, but they weren't comforting either. I sat there long after the door clicked shut, the faint echo of it still reverberating through my chest. There were no dramatic words exchanged, no last-minute apologies, no tearful vows to make things right. Just truth, laid bare between 2 people who had both seen what she was capable of when the spotlight wasn't on her. And yet, despite all of it, part of me still ached. Because what no one tells you is that even when you finally stand up for yourself, even when you burn down the lie you've been living in, the smoke still clings to you. You can win, and it will still hurt. You can be right, and it will still feel like grief. Every time I swallowed my hurt and smiled through it. Every time I said, "It's okay," when it wasn't. Every time I gave when I should have held the line. I did that. I carved myself into the shape she needed, and then wondered why she never recognized me when I stood still. But not anymore. I stood now. I stood in my own pain, my own anger, my own worth. Around midday, I turned my phone back on. I don't know why. Morbid curiosity, maybe. Or hope, in its ugliest form, the kind that lingers even when it's been beaten half to death. There were 23 texts, 5 voicemails, 3 missed calls from unknown numbers, but only 1 message from her. It wasn't long, just a few lines. I can't believe you'd do this to me. I should have known you'd make everything about yourself. You always do. Don't bother trying to fix it. I'm done. I read it once, then again, and then a 3rd time, slower. There it was. The rewriting of history, the pivot, the emotional sleight of hand. She was the victim now. She'd flipped the narrative, cast herself as the abandoned child, the scorned daughter, the innocent party blindsided by her selfish mother. And part of me, God help me, almost believed her. Because that's what happens when you've spent your life loving someone who only loves the version of you that serves them. You start questioning your reality. You start wondering if you are cruel, if maybe you are the problem. But I wasn't. Not this time. This time, I had receipts. In my bank account. In my inbox. In the aching silence of every ignored conversation. Every unreturned gesture. Every time she looked through me like I was invisible. She could rewrite the story all she wanted. But I had finally learned how to read the truth. And the truth was, I didn't leave her. She left me a long time ago. I just finally caught up. I didn't respond to her message. Not because I didn't have anything to say. God, I had everything to say. But because I knew it wouldn't matter. The story in her head had already been written. And in it, I was the villain. The one who ruined her wedding. The one who abandoned her at the altar. The one who turned her perfect day into a catastrophe. That was the version she would cling to, parade around, spoon-feed to anyone willing to listen. Not the truth. Not the years of silence. Not the way she turned motherhood into servitude. Just the drama. Just the pain that served her. But I refused to play my part this time. Instead, I poured myself another cup of tea, sat in the quiet of my home, and let the burn in my chest settle into something that felt a lot like resolve. I didn't sleep that night, not because I was restless, but because I couldn't stop seeing it, the image of her walking down the aisle without me, smiling, laughing, eyes sparkling, like I was never supposed to be there in the first place. I wondered if she noticed my absence, wondered if the silence of the missing music, the unprepared reception hall, the empty floral arrangement sent any message at all, or if she just called it bad luck. A coincidence. Another thing her difficult mother had failed to deliver on. Maybe she had already replaced me in her mind. A mother figure who didn't ask questions, who didn't demand respect, one who smiled more and expected less. But I wasn't built for that. I didn't raise her with hollow lessons. I taught her that love means showing up even when it hurts. That you fight for your people, not manipulate them. That family isn't earned through guilt trips or rehearsed tears, but through honesty, even when it's ugly. She unlearned all of that somewhere along the way. Somewhere I couldn't reach her. Somewhere past the Instagram filters, the fake apologies, and the bridal boards that told her it was her day, and everyone else was just lucky to witness it. 3 days later, I got a letter. Not a text, not an email. A letter. My name was written in familiar cursive on the envelope, the kind I used to help her practice when she was in 2nd grade. The kind she used on thank you cards before she decided gratitude was a currency she no longer dealt in. I stared at it for hours before I opened it. It was short, half a page, but every word was soaked in venom. She said I had embarrassed her in front of his family, that she would never recover from the humiliation, that people were whispering, that she had to cancel the honeymoon, that they were reevaluating everything now, and I owed her an explanation, if not an apology. An apology. The audacity of it made me laugh. A bitter, broken laugh that caught in my throat like glass. She wanted me to apologize for protecting myself, for drawing a boundary, for not sitting quietly in the shadow of the life I had bankrolled while they handed out seating like status symbols. She didn't want peace. She wanted obedience. I folded the letter neatly, placed it back in the envelope, and tucked it in the back of the drawer I had once filled with her baby teeth, her birthday cards, her crayon drawings of stick figures with our names scribbled underneath. The drawer that used to feel like home. Now it just felt like a grave. I didn't write back. What was there to say? That I still loved her? I did. Fiercely. In ways that terrified me. But love without respect is poison. It eats you alive while you're busy pretending it tastes like honey. No one tells you what it feels like to mourn someone who is still alive. To grieve a relationship that keeps breathing without ever being revived. It's like holding a photograph of someone you once knew and realizing the person in it never actually saw you the way you saw them. That's what she became. A stranger with my eyes. My blood, but none of my heart. I was done chasing ghosts. Done bleeding myself dry for people who called it too much the moment I asked for anything back. This wasn't revenge. This wasn't bitterness. This was survival. And I had finally chosen me. The morning after I tucked her letter into that drawer, I stood in front of it for a long time. Just standing there, staring. Not at the letter, not at the drawer itself, but at what it had become. Once, it was a place for keepsakes, proof that I had been a good mother. Now it held a different kind of evidence. That letter, folded precisely, careful handwriting and cruel intent hiding between the lines. I opened the drawer and took out the letter again. I read it slowly, this time without flinching. Each sentence, each accusation, was perfectly designed. Not to open a conversation, not to bridge a distance, but to hurt. She knew what she was doing. She always had. I can't believe you would do this to me. Not to us, to me. That single word burned the brightest. As if I was just a side character in her life story. As if I hadn't fed her, raised her, sacrificed the best years of my life for her comfort, her future, her happiness. She couldn't believe I would choose myself, for once. I should have known you'd make everything about yourself. That was the second cut. That tired, sharp accusation. The one they always reach for when a woman refuses to shrink anymore. When she stops twisting herself into something palatable. You're selfish, they say. As if selfishness is simply the act of saying, no more. The irony of it all? I had never once made anything about me. My entire life had revolved around other people's needs. First her father, who drained me dry and then blamed me when there was nothing left. Then her, who took every ounce of love I had and somehow decided it still wasn't enough. And then finally, after all that time, I stood up. I stopped being useful. And suddenly, I was selfish. I folded the letter one last time, slower now, and walked it to the fireplace. No ceremony, no melodrama. I set it in the grate, lit a match, and let it burn. The paper curled in on itself, turning black at the edges like it knew it had been caught in a lie. The flames were quiet, but the heat was real. I didn't look away until the last flicker turned to ash. That was the moment I stopped hoping for an apology. That was the moment I stopped hoping at all. Because I realized something brutal and necessary. Closure doesn't come from other people. It doesn't come wrapped in forgiveness or regret. It comes from the decision to stop reaching out with bloody hands, begging for someone else to stop cutting. I was done begging. That afternoon, I called my lawyer. We had spoken once before, years ago, when I revised my will to include her. She had just started college then. I remember telling him how proud I was, how she was going to change the world. I had built everything with her in mind. Every account, every asset, every dime tucked away in savings, meant to become her inheritance. "Hi, this is Marlene," I said, my voice steady. "I need to make some changes." He paused, then asked gently, "To the will?" "Yes." He didn't ask why. He didn't need to. We scheduled an appointment for the following week. I hung up the phone and just sat there, breathing through the weight of it all. Not sadness, not relief. Something quieter. Like watching the tide pull away what you'd been clinging to, and realizing the sand beneath your feet feels steadier without it. I had spent so long building a future for her. Now I would build one for myself. Even if I had to do it from scratch. Even if no one stood beside me. Even if it meant learning how to be my own legacy. Because the truth was simple. She had made her choice. And now, I was making mine. The morning I sat across from my lawyer, I wore the same black coat I had buried my mother in. Not out of symbolism, not for drama, but because I needed armor. Something heavy, Something that reminded me I'd survived worse than this. That I could walk into this room and undo years of intention without unraveling completely. He greeted me with the same polite smile he always had. Professional, practiced, careful. I didn't return it. I didn't have room for polite anymore. Not after everything. I sat down. I handed him the binder. And I said the words like I was cutting a wire. I want her removed from everything. He blinked. Marlene, are you sure? I nodded once. Not slow, not uncertain, just final. He didn't ask why. That's the thing about good lawyers. They know the difference between grief and clarity. They don't confuse emotion with weakness. He slid the binder open, flipped to the pages with her name, her full legal name, the one I gave her the day she was born, and crossed her out with a single red stroke. It wasn't even dramatic. Just a line, a gesture, like she never existed in that space to begin with. I felt it land in my chest like a crack through old stone. I didn't cry. Not in that office. Not in front of someone who still saw me as capable, as sharp. I swallowed it down like medicine, bitter, but necessary. She would never know how hard it was to do that. She would never understand what it meant for me to sign those papers. That it wasn't just money. It wasn't about revenge. It was the slow, steady erasure of every dream I had of leaving her something when I was gone. Of still mattering even after death. And maybe that was the hardest part. Realizing that I had spent decades planning a legacy for someone who no longer saw me as part of her future. When I got home, the house was too quiet again. The kind of quiet that isn't peaceful. The kind that feels like a punishment. Every photo still hung on the wall. Every memory still lived in the furniture, the carpet, the way the light hit the corners of the kitchen where she used to sit and do her homework. It was like my life hadn't caught up to the truth yet. She was gone. But everything still looked like she was here. So I started packing. Not everything, just enough to feel movement. I cleared the drawers of old birthday cards. I folded the dress she wore to her high school graduation and placed it in a box I labeled Memories I Didn't Ask to Lose. I pulled photo frames off the wall one by one, careful not to let the glass crack in my hands. It wasn't about erasing her. It was about releasing myself. Because I had been clinging to the past like it could still save me. Like maybe if I held on long enough, she'd turn around and say, "I see you now." But she wouldn't. She had made that clear. And the most painful part of loving someone who's already left you is realizing how long you stayed behind. That night, I sat on the living room floor surrounded by boxes, and I let the silence wash over me. This time, I didn't fight it. I didn't try to fill it. I just listened. To my breath. To my heartbeat. To the woman I used to be, whispering, "You made it through." Because I had. And maybe, for the first time in my life, I wasn't surviving for anyone else. I wasn't holding on so someone else could feel safe. I wasn't sacrificing to prove my worth. It started with the sound of a car door slamming outside. I was sitting on the floor again, same position as the night before, legs crossed in front of a box labeled Keep or Burn, when I heard it. The sharp, purposeful slam that comes when someone's too angry to hide it. I didn't move at first. Just stayed there, fingers wrapped around an old photo of her in kindergarten, missing both front teeth, her smile so wide it made my chest ache. Another sound followed. Footsteps. Hard ones. Unapologetic. Then the doorbell. I didn't have to look. I knew it was her. I could feel her through the door like a pulse, like a storm you can smell before it breaks open the sky. I stood up slowly. Not out of fear, not even hesitation, but because I wanted to meet her on my terms. I wasn't the same woman who had waited for approval, for affection. That woman had been boxed away with the rest of the dreams I'd stopped clinging to. When I opened the door, she was standing there in a black coat, almost identical to mine. Her makeup was smudged under her eyes, like she'd either been crying or didn't bother taking it off the night before. Her hair was tied back the way she always did when she didn't want to be touched. For a second, she didn't say anything, just stared at me like she didn't recognize me, like she was waiting for me to speak first. But I didn't. She crossed her arms and looked past me, into the house. "So," she said, her voice sharp and thin, "I guess you got what you wanted." I didn't flinch. "What exactly do you think that is?" She stepped forward, but I didn't move, didn't invite her in. "You ruined everything," she snapped. "You humiliated me. You left. You didn't even stay to see how bad it got." "I didn't need to see it," I said quietly. "I already lived it." Her jaw clenched. She looked away. And for a moment, I thought maybe, there was something beneath all of it. Maybe she had come to apologize, to talk, to face the way she'd cut me out and expected me to keep smiling like it didn't cost me anything. But instead, she pulled a piece of paper from her coat pocket and held it out like it was a weapon. "What is this?" she demanded. I didn't have to look. I knew what it was. A copy of the amended will. One of the automatic notifications sent out after the documents were finalized. She must have received hers in the mail that morning. "I think it's self-explanatory." "You're cutting me out? Me?" I met her eyes, and for the first time in a long, long time, I didn't feel small in front of her. I didn't feel like the woman who had spent years apologizing for not being perfect, for not being more agreeable, more docile, more useful. "Yes," I said. "I am." She blinked. "You're unbelievable." "No," I corrected. "I'm finally believable. You just never thought I'd actually do it." Her expression cracked for just a moment, something raw, almost childlike flashing across her face. She looked like she wanted to scream, or cry, or run. But instead, she stood there, frozen in her own disbelief. "I needed you," she whispered, her voice suddenly small. "And you weren't there." I could have said 1,000 things. I could have reminded her of the years I was there, when no one else was, when even she wasn't. I could have listed every birthday I spent working, every night I sat up alone wondering if she'd call. But I didn't, because I didn't need to defend myself anymore. "I was always there," I said instead. "You just stopped seeing me." Her lips parted like she wanted to reply, but nothing came out. And then, just like that, she turned around, walked back to her car. No apology, no acknowledgement, just the sound of tires crunching gravel and the ache of a door I hadn't closed yet. I stood there in the open threshold, the paper still fluttering on the ground between us like a broken bridge. But I didn't pick it up. I didn't chase her. I let the wind carry it away. The next morning, I found the will notification lying in the garden. Damp from the night's rain, corners curled, ink slightly blurred. It had drifted on the wind overnight, settled like a forgotten truth among the rose bushes I planted back when she still called me Mommy. I stared at it for a long time before bending down to pick it up. The envelope had come open, the paper inside warped and weak. I didn't read it again. I didn't need to. I knew what it said. She knew too. She could pretend she didn't. She could rage and scream and throw words like blades, but none of it would change the fact that I had cut the final string. The one she thought would always be there no matter how hard she pulled. I dropped the paper into the trash can without ceremony. Let the lid close like a coffin. Done. It wasn't even noon when the next letter arrived. Not hers, his. John. I recognized the handwriting before I opened the envelope. I could still see it on every joint tax return, every birthday card he signed in a rush, every passive-aggressive post-it he used to leave on the fridge when he still lived here. I didn't want to open it, but I did. Of course I did. Because even after everything, part of me still needed to know just how deep the rot had spread. The letter was 4 pages long. He wrote like a man who thought he was being rational, reasonable. The tone of someone who wanted to appear concerned, but couldn't quite hide the smirk behind his sentences. He said he was disappointed in how I'd handled things. That I had embarrassed our daughter, and by extension, him. He said I was spiraling. That my decision to exclude her from my will was proof that I was emotionally unstable. He reminded me of how generous he'd been during the divorce, as if I had forgotten, as if his generosity hadn't come with strings, conditions, and ultimatums, as if I hadn't rebuilt my life from the ground up while he played house with his new wife and a credit card I paid off. He closed the letter by saying he'd spoken with someone, that there might be grounds for concern, and that, if things continued this way, there would have to be further action. The threat wasn't loud, but it was there, coiled beneath the ink like a snake waiting to strike. They were working together now, him and her, father and daughter, united not by love, but by control. And I was the common enemy. It should have crushed me. Years ago, it would have. Back when I still wanted things to go back to the way they were. Back when I still believed that if I just gave a little more, bent a little further, they'd see me, love me, protect me. But not anymore. I folded the letter, walked it to the shredder, and fed it through. Not because I was angry, because I was done. That was the moment I realized something terrifying and liberating. They weren't going to stop. They weren't going to wake up one morning filled with remorse and softness. They weren't going to apologize, to beg for forgiveness, to see me as anything other than an obstacle in the way of what they believed they were owed. And so I stopped waiting for decency. I called Linda, my lawyer, told her to prepare for escalation, asked her what protections I could put in place, power of attorney, medical directives, financial locks, everything. Make it airtight, I said. No loopholes, no access. I don't care what they try. I want to be a fortress. She didn't ask questions, just said, understood. I'll get started right away. By sunset, I had locked the gate to the front drive, changed the security code on the house, called the bank, called the brokerage, locked down every account with passwords only I knew. Because love is not an excuse for invasion. Because blood is not a promise. Because even a mother, even a woman raised to bend and serve and sacrifice, can look at her child, look at her ex-husband, and say, enough. You will not take one more thing from me. Not now. Not ever again. I didn't cry. Not when I locked the gate. Not when I set new passwords and told the bank manager I wanted no one else to have access. Not even in an emergency. Not when I sat in my lawyer's office signing document after document that legally fortified the walls around my life. I cried when I walked past the hallway mirror and saw myself. Not the woman I'd been, wrung out, quiet, used to shrinking herself to make others feel bigger. Not the broken mother, not the bitter ex-wife. I saw someone else entirely. A woman who had chosen to become untouchable. A woman who had finally stopped asking for permission to be safe in her own damn home. And it wasn't strength that brought the tears. It was grief. Because no one tells you that healing feels like a funeral. That protecting yourself sometimes means burying the version of you that everyone loved, simply because she was so easy to hurt. That night, I poured a glass of wine, not to celebrate, not even to soothe, but to mark something. An invisible line between who I had been and who I would never be again. I sat in the living room, barefoot on the hardwood floor, a stack of old photo albums beside me. Not to reminisce, not to torture myself, but because I needed to see the evidence. I needed to remind myself that none of this was imagined, that I hadn't conjured the history between us out of loneliness or disappointment. Every page confirmed it. Me, standing in the rain, holding her tiny hand under a too-small umbrella. Me, holding her in my lap as she cried over a scraped knee, her head buried in my chest. Me, at every school play, every graduation, every milestone where her father conveniently had a conflict, or couldn't make it, or simply didn't show. I was always there, until I wasn't. And even then, not by choice. They talk about a mother's love like it's this limitless, bottomless thing. And maybe it is. But limitless doesn't mean boundaryless. And for years, I let them believe it did. I let them take and take and take, because I thought that was the price of being needed, the cost of relevance. But need isn't love. Control isn't care. And proximity isn't presence. It took me a long time to unlearn that. The next morning, I received another letter. This one wasn't from John. It wasn't from her either. It was from a law firm I didn't recognize, with a polished, embossed seal at the top. Cold language. Formal. Notice of intent to pursue conservatorship. There it was. The next move. They were going to try to declare me mentally unfit, take control of my finances, my medical decisions, my property, everything I'd built. They weren't done. Of course they weren't. This wasn't about love. This was about power, about inheritance, about making sure the woman they couldn't manipulate anymore was stripped of every choice she had left. I read the letter twice, then a third time, and then, for the first time in weeks, I laughed. Because they had underestimated me again. They still thought I was weak, still thought I would break under pressure, that I would cower, collapse, and beg them to stop. But they didn't realize something crucial. I had already died once. That quiet, loyal, guilt-ridden woman they used to guilt into submission? She was gone. The one standing in her place? She wasn't afraid of courtrooms. She wasn't afraid of smear campaigns, or whispered rumors at church, or family dinners that would never happen again. She was afraid of nothing now, because nothing left to lose means nothing left to fear. I called Linda immediately. "They've filed," I told her, not even trying to soften it. There was a pause on the other end. "They're trying to declare you incompetent?" "Yes." "Then we fight. We expose every thread of this, every email, every payment, every manipulative move they've made. You let me handle the law. You just be honest." Honest. Because the truth was going to hurt. For them. For me. For anyone who thought family was always sacred. For anyone who thought blood should excuse betrayal. But I didn't care. They wanted war? Fine. I'd give them one. But this time, I was bringing every receipt, every wound, every moment I bit my tongue when I should have screamed. And I would burn it all down before I let them take what was mine. The first time I stepped into the courtroom, I felt nothing. No fear, no anxiety, no shame. Not because I wasn't angry, not because I didn't understand what was at stake, but because I had finally made peace with the worst thing that could happen. They might win. They might convince a judge I was unstable, that I was declining, that I had made a series of emotional, irrational decisions and could no longer be trusted with my life, that I needed to be protected from myself. But they would never be able to say I had been silent. They would never be able to say I hadn't fought back. So I walked in with my head held high, my jaw clenched, and my heart steeled against every glance I knew would come. John was already seated at the front. Of course he was. In a crisp gray suit, like he'd dressed for a job interview, not a legal ambush on the woman he once swore to love. He didn't look at me. Cowardice dressed in courtroom polish. Next to him sat my daughter. She wore black. Not somber black. Not respectful black. Designer black. She looked like she was attending a brunch, not a hearing that could determine whether her own mother would be stripped of autonomy. She barely glanced in my direction. And when she did, her eyes slid past me like I was a stranger in line at the grocery store. That was the moment it stopped hurting. That single glance, the one that saw nothing, remembered nothing, felt nothing. It hollowed me out in the most permanent final way. You can't mourn someone who's already buried you. Linda sat beside me, calm, unshakable. Her presence was a lighthouse, guiding me through the storm I had already decided wouldn't drown me. We waited. Then the judge entered. Older, sharp-eyed. The kind of man who had heard 100 cases like mine, but still carried the weight of each one in his face. He didn't smile, didn't frown, just scanned the room with eyes that saw too much and trusted too little. Perfect. The hearing began. John's lawyer was first, a smug man in a suit 2 sizes too expensive for his soul. He spoke with measured concern, his voice dipped in condescension, like I was a fragile vase about to topple from a high shelf. He laid out their evidence. Bank withdrawals I had made recently, the canceled wedding contracts, the updated will, all cited as signs of emotional instability, paranoia, questionable behavior from a woman who used to be so reasonable. Then they introduced statements, emails between me and my daughter, ones she had conveniently trimmed, removing every insult she had sent, every cruel dismissal, leaving only my responses, stripped of context, reeking of desperation. She has shown erratic behavior, Your Honor, the lawyer said, alienating her only child, making abrupt financial decisions, disinheriting her family. These are not the choices of a well woman. I didn't flinch. I let him talk. Let him pile on the words like dirt over a casket. Because I knew what was coming next. Linda stood when it was our turn. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. She laid out every receipt, every payment I had made for the wedding, the texts I had received after being seated in the aisle, the long history of my support, financial, emotional, physical. And then, like the steady click of a lock turning, she introduced testimony. A statement from my doctor, mentally sound, physically independent. A letter from my financial advisor, stable, consistent, cautious. A declaration from my neighbor. Marlene is sharper than most people half her age. She knows exactly what she's doing. And then Linda turned to me. Would you like to speak? She asked. I stood. My hands didn't shake. I looked the judge in the eye. I didn't glance at John. I didn't give her the satisfaction of acknowledgement. My name is Marlene Roberts, I said. I raised my daughter alone after her father left. I worked 3 jobs to keep her fed, educated, and safe. I put her name in my will when she was 18 because I believed she would honor what I built. I believed she would care for what I would one day leave behind. I paused. Not for effect. For breath. For pain. But I was wrong. She does not love me. She loves what I can give her. She does not care for my well-being. She cares about access, control, power. I'm not here because I've lost touch with reality. I'm here because I've finally stopped sacrificing myself to maintain someone else's illusion of family. Silence. The judge didn't speak for a long time, but when he finally did, it was with gravity. We'll reconvene next week for my decision, he said. Until then, Ms. Roberts retains full legal control of her affairs. That was it. The gavel didn't fall, but everything inside me did. Not broken, Released. The week between the hearing and the judge's ruling felt like walking a tightrope with a noose waiting at either end. I didn't sleep. Not really. I lay in bed each night staring at the ceiling, counting the seconds between thoughts like they were footsteps through a minefield. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw their faces, my daughter's indifference, John's smug silence, the lawyer's manufactured pity. I'd replayed every word I spoke in court, not because I regretted them, but because I knew they were the last words I'd speak with the illusion of family still barely intact. Outside, the leaves had begun to turn. October was always my favorite month, the air sharp enough to feel alive, the trees shedding what no longer served them. I used to tell my daughter that fall was the season where the earth remembered how to let go. It felt poetic once. Now it just felt like a cruel metaphor. Letting go, I was learning, isn't peaceful. It's violent. It's messy. It rips the skin from your bones and asks you to smile through the blood. I still hadn't heard from her. Not since the courtroom. Not a text, not a call, not even a carefully written email through clenched teeth. And I didn't expect one. If she was anything like her father, and God help me, she was already spinning the story to anyone who'd listen. She's unstable. She's dramatic. She's punishing me because I finally stood up to her. The projection writes itself. I stopped checking social media weeks ago. I didn't need to see the curated sob story. The inspirational quotes about setting boundaries and choosing peace posted like shields, like she hadn't spent the last year bleeding me dry while smiling for the camera. Linda called me 3 days before the ruling. "There's something you need to know," she said, and my stomach tightened the way it always did when someone started a sentence like that. She paused, like she was bracing for my reaction. "They've started contacting the local paper." I didn't speak. "They're trying to push a narrative. John's feeding a reporter information. He's saying you're volatile, unpredictable, that the court case is about elder protection." I almost laughed. "Elder protection," I repeated, the words bitter in my mouth. "From what? Independent thought?" Linda didn't laugh with me. "They're painting you as the aggressor. You need to be prepared. If the ruling goes in our favor, and I believe it will, they'll escalate." Of course they would. Because the truth had never been enough for either of them. What mattered wasn't what was real. What mattered was what could be believed. And people are always quicker to believe a mother's gone mad than a daughter's gone cruel. After I hung up, I sat on the porch for the first time in weeks, wrapped in a blanket, tea going cold in my hands. The wind had picked up, rattling the trees until they sounded like they were clapping for a funeral no one wanted to attend. I remembered when she was 5 and fell off her bike in this same driveway. Skin scraped, knees bloodied, wailing like her heart was broken. I had rushed to her side, scooped her up, kissed her hair, whispered that she was okay, that I was there, that I'd always be there. And now she was tearing that woman down in headlines, disassembling me piece by piece, trying to convince the world I was a threat when I had only ever been a shield. That night, I wrote a letter. Not to her, to myself. I wrote down everything. Every moment I'd swallowed pain to keep the peace. Every time I had chosen silence over truth, endurance over dignity. I wrote about the wedding, about the aisle seat, about the way she looked at me like I was an inconvenience in the story of her life. I wrote until my hand cramped, and the words blurred and my breath came ragged through my teeth. Then I folded it, placed it in the same drawer where her letter used to be, now emptied. Not as a record, as a reminder of who I was, of what I had survived, of the woman I had become when no one else showed up. And when the morning of the ruling arrived, I woke up not as her mother, not as John's ex-wife, not as a woman on trial, but as Marlene Roberts, whole, unshaken, and finally free to stop explaining why I deserved to be treated like a human being. The morning of the ruling, the sky was heavy. One of those gray, swollen mornings where the light barely filters through the clouds, and everything feels like it's holding its breath. I stood in front of the mirror in my bedroom and buttoned my coat slowly, like I was dressing for a funeral. In a way, I was. Not the funeral of my rights, not anymore. That threat had come and gone, and I had met it head on. No, this was something deeper, more permanent. Today was the burial of illusion, of hope, of the last sliver of belief that maybe, just maybe, there would be a version of this story where my daughter walked in and said, "I'm sorry. I was wrong. I see you now." She wouldn't. I knew that. And still, that last little ember had lived inside me, glowing in the dark, refusing to die. But today, I was going to put it out myself. Linda met me outside the courthouse. Her presence, as always, was grounding, clean lines, calm expression, sharp mind. She didn't ask how I was. She knew better. She just walked beside me, steady and sure, as we entered the building where my own child had tried to gut me in public. The courtroom was colder than last time. John was there, of course, pretending to be unreadable but failing. His lips were too tight, eyes too proud, body too relaxed. He thought he had won something just by dragging me this far. Next to him, my daughter looked like a shadow of herself. Her hair was pulled back in a severe knot, no earrings, no smile, dressed in beige like she thought neutrality could mask intent. But I could still see it in her eyes, that calculated distance, that unwillingness to soften even now, even here. Her arms were crossed, her jaw locked. She hadn't come for the truth. She'd come to watch me break. And that was the moment I realized she never knew me at all. The judge entered. No preamble, no posturing, just quiet authority. He shuffled through his notes and then looked up, eyes scanning the room, pausing on each of us like he was measuring weight before passing sentence. And then he spoke. "I've reviewed all documents, testimony, and supplemental evidence provided by both parties," he said, his voice low and deliberate. "I see no signs of cognitive decline, emotional instability, or diminished capacity. Quite the opposite." My chest stayed still, frozen between heartbeats. Ms. Roberts has demonstrated full awareness of her choices, their implications, and her legal rights. She is lucid, consistent, and within her full capacity to manage her affairs. The petition for conservatorship is denied. Permanently. He didn't slam a gavel. He didn't need to. The silence that followed was louder than any bang of wood on wood. John shifted uncomfortably. My daughter didn't move. I felt my shoulders relax for the first time in weeks. Not completely, just enough to breathe without pain. The judge wasn't finished. "I would also encourage both parties," he added, glancing at John and then at her, "to consider the emotional and reputational consequences of weaponizing legal systems for personal conflict. This courtroom is not a battlefield. It is not a tool for revenge. It is a place for justice." He stood, and it was over. Just like that. We filed out in silence. No one spoke to me. No one looked at me. It was like I was invisible again, only this time, it didn't sting. It felt clean. Empty, yes. But empty in the way a house feels after you've cleared out the clutter. Outside, the air had shifted. The clouds had split open slightly, letting in thin streaks of gold. Linda touched my arm. "You did it," she said softly. "No," I replied. "I survived it. There's a difference." She nodded, and then she left, giving me space. Because she understood what they never would, winning doesn't feel like triumph when you had to lose everything to get there. I stood on the courthouse steps for a long time. My daughter didn't come after me. I knew she wouldn't. That would have required more than anger. It would have required reflection, courage, accountability, none of which she had ever truly shown me. And I didn't wait. I walked down those steps slowly, deliberately, feeling the weight of everything behind me fall away like a coat I didn't need anymore. They had tried to silence me, tried to strip me of my life, my autonomy, my voice. But I had spoken. I had stood. I had refused to sit quietly in the aisle again. And now, finally, they couldn't touch me. Not my mind, not my money, not my name. I was Marlene Roberts, and I was no longer theirs. It wasn't until I got home, slipped off my coat, and stood in the doorway of my kitchen that the weight of everything finally caught up with me. Not in the way people expect, not with tears or sobbing or some dramatic collapse into a chair. No, it came quietly, like fog rolling into the corners of a room. It came in the silence, in the stillness, in the way I looked at the coffee pot and remembered all the mornings I brewed 2 cups just in case she came downstairs early, back when she still lived here. Back when there was still something soft between us. Something unsaid, but understood. Now there was nothing. I made myself tea and forgot to drink it. The sunlight slanted through the windows at that late afternoon angle that makes everything look golden, even the dust. And for a moment, I just stood there, palms flat on the countertop, listening to the hum of the refrigerator and the blood in my ears. The judge had said no. No conservatorship. No control. No power handed over to the people who had twisted my love into leverage. I was safe. Legally, anyway. But peace doesn't arrive on a court order. It has to be reclaimed. And I didn't know what that looked like yet. I wandered the house like it belonged to someone else, room by room, letting my fingers trail across the walls, the furniture, the forgotten photographs still clinging to the shelves. The evidence of a life lived for someone else. A life spent waiting for recognition that never came. I passed the empty hallway where her prom dress once hung, pressed and ready. The bathroom door I used to knock on when she spent too long curling her hair, worried she'd burn herself. The living room where she opened gifts every Christmas, always pretending she didn't peek beforehand, even though she always did. I stopped at the stairs. Halfway up was the 3rd step, the one that creaked when you put your full weight on it. I used to skip it when she was a baby, just to avoid waking her. Back when silence was a kindness, not a punishment. Funny how life circles back to itself like that. That night, I slept with the bedroom window open. Let the cold air roll over me. Let the sound of wind and rustling leaves drown out the thoughts that tried to claw their way to the surface. I didn't dream of her. That part of me was quiet now, finally. No more imagined apologies. No more fantasy reunions. No more whispered "I miss you," mom that never came. I woke up before sunrise, and I knew I couldn't live in this house anymore. Not because of them, not because of the pain, but because I was still holding on to every room like it owed me something. As if memory would one day bloom into closure. It wouldn't. It never would. You can't heal in the place where you were broken and expected to smile through it. I called the realtor before I had even brushed my teeth, told her I was ready, that I wanted it listed immediately. No delay, no walkthroughs to prep the space. I didn't care about the value. I didn't care about the market. I cared about breathing again. She sounded surprised. "Are you sure, Ms. Roberts? I thought you were holding off." "I'm not holding anything anymore," I said, cutting her off. I packed slowly, carefully. I wasn't in a rush, but I was precise. Some things I burned, old cards, letters, receipts from the wedding I never attended. Others I boxed up for charity. A few I kept, not because I needed the reminders, but because they belonged to me before they belonged to her. By the end of the week, the house was hollow. Echoes where there used to be noise. Footsteps that didn't land in the same way. The house didn't fight me on it. It knew. It had always known. It had witnessed everything. The silence, the manipulation, the slow unraveling of motherhood into martyrdom. It was time to let go. Both of us. On the last day, I stood in the empty foyer, key in hand, and whispered a single word. Enough. Not goodbye. Not thank you. Just that. Enough. Because I had given more than I ever should have. And now I was walking away. Not ruined. Not bitter. Not even angry. Just done. The door closed behind me. And for the first time in decades, there was no one left to ask me where I was going. So I got in the car, pulled out of the driveway, and didn't look back. Because forward was all I had left. And it was finally mine. The road stretched out ahead of me like a vein, long, winding, pulsing with the weight of everything I was leaving behind. I didn't have a plan. Not really. No destination typed into the GPS. Just a direction, a way. And sometimes that's all you need to know. I drove for hours, past the town line, past the county, through fields that turned gold in the sun, and then dark as the clouds rolled in. I let the miles carve space between me and the house, between me and the courtroom, between me and every ghost that had learned to say my name like it was a burden. It wasn't about escape. It was about reclamation. Somewhere along the way, I realized I had no one left to notify. No one to text, made it safe. No one who'd check in by nightfall. I was entirely unaccounted for. And instead of fear, I felt relief. There's something holy about being untraceable. When your life no longer belongs to someone else's schedule, someone else's expectations. When you finally stop performing your identity for people who never saw you in the first place. By the time I checked into a roadside motel, small, unremarkable, but clean, the sun had dropped out of the sky. I turned on a single lamp, tossed my bag on the bed, and sat down, like my body had only just remembered how to be tired. It wasn't physical exhaustion. It was cellular, bone deep. The kind of tired that comes after surviving a war no one else believed you were in. I stared at my reflection in the motel mirror, the dim bulb casting strange shadows across my face. I didn't look like the woman who raised a daughter, or the one who stood beside a husband and pretended that was enough. I didn't even look like the woman who stood in a courtroom and tore her own heart out in the name of self-defense. I looked like a woman no one owned, and I liked it. The next morning I woke with the sun, packed my things in silence, and drove again. Not out of restlessness, but instinct. I didn't want to stay too long in one place. Not yet. The past still felt too close. Like if I stopped moving, it might catch up and try to crawl back under my skin. I ended up in a small coastal town 2 days later. A place I had visited once when I was young, before marriage, before motherhood, before I learned that giving everything didn't guarantee anything in return. I remembered the shoreline, the sound of gulls, the way the sea air burned your lungs just enough to remind you were alive. I rented a small cottage at the edge of town. Nothing extravagant, just 2 bedrooms, a porch, and the scent of salt always lingering in the walls. The kind of place where people didn't ask questions, where no one cared what you were running from, or what you had to leave behind to get here. That first night, I sat on the porch wrapped in a blanket, sipping a glass of wine as the ocean swallowed the horizon. And for the first time in longer than I could remember, I didn't feel haunted. No voices echoing in my head, no guilt thrumming in my veins, just the sea, the wind, and me. I didn't miss her. Not the version of her that existed now. Not the girl who turned her mother's devotion into ammunition. Not the woman who sat beside her father in court and said nothing while he tried to steal my life away. But I did miss something. The child who used to hold my hand without thinking. The one who used to cry for me in the night. Who used to look at me like I was safe. That version? She was gone. Maybe she never existed the way I remembered. Maybe I'd projected my own tenderness onto someone who learned early how to weaponize affection. Still, I let the ache settle. Not to wallow, but to honor the parts of me I'd had to cut away to survive. And then I made a vow, to myself, not to her, that this new chapter would not be defined by their absence, that my peace would not be a reaction to their cruelty, but a reclamation of my own power, that I would build something here, something real, something unshakable, because I was no longer running. I was arriving. The first week in the cottage passed like a whisper. I didn't speak much, didn't need to. There was no one to answer to, no one to make small talk with, no one asking what was for dinner or when I was coming home. The silence wasn't heavy anymore. It was soft, like cotton pulled over raw skin. I woke when I wanted, ate when I remembered, and walked along the shoreline until my legs ached and the soles of my shoes wore thin. Every step I took on that sand felt like peeling a layer off my old life. One breath at a time. One tide-washed moment where I didn't have to be anyone but a woman unmaking herself. I started a journal, just for me. Not the kind filled with perfect affirmations or gratitude lists. No, this was something grittier. A place to say what I really felt without being accused of bitterness. Rage that had gone quiet. Sadness that had stopped asking to be fixed. I wrote, "She sat me in the aisle at her wedding and thought I would stay there. That was her mistake." Some days, I didn't write at all. Some days, I sat on the porch with a cup of coffee and watched the waves until they blurred into the sky. Other days, I wandered into town, bought myself fresh flowers, visited the bookstore, lingered in cafes, and listened to strangers talk about their lives. Small, ordinary lives filled with nothing special and everything meaningful. I watched a woman argue kindly with her partner about what kind of bread to buy. I saw a little girl pick out seashells for her grandmother. I heard an old man hum while fixing a bike outside his shop. None of it was mine, but it didn't have to be. It was enough to witness something that wasn't broken. One afternoon, I got a letter. No return address. For a second, I thought it might be from her. That maybe, somewhere between the courtroom and the fallout, she had finally cracked open and let something human spill out. But it wasn't. It was from John. 2 pages. Neatly typed. No salutation. Just straight into it, like he thought he still had the right to be direct with me. He said he hoped I was finding peace, but felt it was necessary to let me know how much damage I had caused. He spoke of embarrassment, of the strain I had placed on their relationship, of how everyone was talking, and how she was grieving the mother she thought she had. I read it once, then again, slower. Every word was soaked in projection, in cruelty dressed as disappointment. It wasn't grief, it was ownership. The tantrum of a man who'd lost his grip. He ended it with, "We hope someday you find the clarity you're clearly missing." That was the sentence that made me laugh. Out loud. A sharp, breathless sound that startled even me. Because I had never seen things clearer. I didn't reply. I folded the letter, walked down to the shoreline, and fed it to the sea. The paper darkened, softened, and then slipped beneath the water, like it had never mattered. That evening, I lit a fire in the hearth and sat cross-legged in front of it, watching the flames twist like dancers. And I thought, not about him, not about her, but about me. About the girl I used to be. The one who once dreamed of a family that didn't feel like an obligation. The one who thought motherhood would look like a partnership, not a contract signed in silence. And for the first time, I forgave her for trying so hard. I forgave the woman who stayed too long, who made excuses, who kept showing up to conversations where she wasn't allowed to speak, who gave until she forgot how to ask for anything in return. I forgave her for believing love would be enough to make someone choose you. And I thanked her for surviving. Because now, I could take what she gave me and build something new. Not out of spite, not out of rage, but out of reverence. This new life, this quiet, fierce, sacred life, was not a retreat. It was a resurrection. It happened on a Sunday. The kind of Sunday that feels slow on purpose. Light filtered through the linen curtains like honey, warm and golden, and the air outside smelled faintly of sea salt and wet stone. I had just finished watering the potted succulents on the porch, my small, stubborn attempt to nurture something that didn't ask for too much, when I saw it. An envelope, thicker than the last, handwritten, familiar slant to the letters. Her name. I stared at it like it had teeth. For a long moment, I didn't move. My hand hovered just above the mail pile like touching it would pull me backward into something I'd already fought tooth and nail to climb out of. But curiosity is a quiet thief, and I've always been guilty of letting it pick my locks. So I took it inside, sat at the kitchen table where no one else had ever eaten with me, and opened it slowly, like it might explode. Inside were 8 pages, 8 uneven, frantic, ink-blotted pages, all in her handwriting. Not typed, not rehearsed, not sterile and lawyer-approved. Her voice, raw on paper. She started with the word Mom. I sat back in the chair, exhaling through my nose. Not because the word softened me, but because it didn't. Because the distance between the title and the person writing it had become so wide, it felt like she was addressing a ghost. The first lines were an apology, but not the kind I had waited for. It wasn't, "I'm sorry I hurt you." It wasn't, "I'm sorry I tried to take everything you built." It was, "I'm sorry you felt like I hurt you. I was going through a lot." That's not an apology. That's a dodge dressed as remorse. Still, I kept reading. Because I wanted to understand how she saw it. I needed to see the version of me that lived in her mind. She talked about her wedding, about the stress, the pressure, the way she'd felt overwhelmed by expectation, how she hadn't realized what it would look like to seat me off to the side, how she thought I'd understand, that it wasn't personal, just logistics, as if dignity is logistical, as if being ushered to the periphery of your own child's life could ever be anything but personal. She mentioned the courtroom, briefly, said she wished it hadn't gone that far, that Dad got too involved, that lawyers made things worse, that maybe it could have been different if we had just talked. But we had talked, or tried to. I had asked, again and again, for her to see me, to hear me, to stop using me as a crutch when it suited her, and a scapegoat when it didn't. I had asked her to meet me as a person, not just a resource. And every time, she gave me silence. Or worse, gaslighted empathy that twisted my pain into proof of my instability. Then came the last 3 pages. That was where the cracks began to show. She said she'd been seeing someone, a therapist, that it wasn't about me, it was about her, about the weight she'd carried all her life, the shame, the pressure to perform, to be perfect, to please. That she was beginning to realize how often she took that out on me, how often she'd weaponized my love because it was always there, because it had never run out. She admitted that part. She said, "You were always there, and I never said thank you because I thought you always would be." That was the first sentence that landed. That was the one that broke something loose inside me. I remembered the look in her eyes the day I told her I was selling the house. The panic that wasn't about me leaving. It was about her losing a place to return to. A safety net she had shredded but still expected to catch her. The fury that only children with unshakable entitlement can feel. She had mistaken me for permanent. She ended the letter with a question. Can we talk? Just that. No phone number. No demand. No guilt-ridden pleas to forget everything that had happened. Just the question. It sat there like an open door. Not wide, just cracked. I folded the letter and placed it on the table. Made a cup of tea I didn't drink. Walked the length of the porch, twice, until the soles of my feet felt grounded enough to hold the weight of what came next. Because the truth was, I didn't know. I didn't know if I wanted to talk. I didn't know if I had it in me to crack myself back open for someone who had proven they didn't know how to hold me without cutting. But I also didn't know if I could walk away without trying. One last time. Not for her. For me. Because maybe closure isn't about walking off into the sunset with your head held high. Maybe it's about being able to sit across from the person who broke you, look them in the eye, and not feel small. That night, I wrote back. I kept it simple. You may come, but you come to listen. No accusations, no rehashing, no giving her the power to make this about her feelings again. Just terms. My terms. Something I had never laid out before because I was too afraid she'd walk. Now I wasn't afraid. If she walked, she walked. I sent the letter the next morning, and for a week, nothing. No reply. No knock on the door. Just silence. Then, on the 8th day, I heard tires on gravel. My heart didn't race. My hands didn't shake. I just stood and watched through the window as she stepped out of the car. No makeup, no carefully curated expression. Just her. Smaller than I remembered. Not in body, but in presence. She stood at the edge of the porch like she didn't know whether she was allowed to enter. I opened the door, said nothing. She looked at me for a long time, eyes glassy, shoulders drawn in. Then finally, she spoke. I got your letter. I nodded once. She didn't ask to come in. She didn't reach for a hug. She just sat down on the steps like the weight of everything she hadn't said had finally brought her to her knees. We sat in silence for 10 minutes. Maybe more. Then she whispered, I didn't know how to stop needing you without resenting you. I didn't answer. I didn't have to. Because she was finally saying something real. And I was finally being seen. We didn't fix everything that day. We didn't hug and cry and promise to rebuild. We didn't even go inside. But something shifted. Not reconciliation. Not forgiveness. But maybe the beginning of truth. And that, after all this time, was enough. I used to think that survival meant staying. Staying in the room even when it went quiet. Staying in the relationship even after it stopped being kind. Staying at the table even when I was no longer fed, just expected to serve. I thought endurance was the badge of love. That if I held on long enough, if I proved myself generous enough, if I gave enough, they would see me. They would choose me. But survival, I've learned, doesn't always look like loyalty. Sometimes it looks like walking away. Sometimes it looks like locking your own front door and sleeping peacefully for the first time in years. Sometimes it looks like saying, no, even when your voice shakes. It's knowing you don't need to be seated in the front row to be the center of your own life. I don't have all the answers. I'm not some enlightened woman who climbed the mountain and came back down with a pocket full of wisdom. I still miss her sometimes, in the way you miss the shape of a wound before it scabs. I still ache when I walk past mothers and daughters who speak with ease, who laugh like nothing was ever fractured. I still catch myself setting the table for two. But I no longer confuse pain with purpose. I no longer let someone else's love be the measure of my worth. And if I've learned anything, anything at all, it's this. You can be cut from your own family and still survive. You can be left out, overlooked, pushed aside, and still come home to yourself. Because healing isn't always a beautiful thing. Sometimes it's lonely. Sometimes it's ugly. But it's yours. And no one, not even your own blood, gets to take it from you. I didn't just survive what they did to me. I survived what I almost did to myself, trying to make them happy. That's the truth. And it's enough. I am the woman who left the aisle and chose herself. And I am still here. We're grateful you stayed with us. For more stories of women reclaiming their voice, click on the left and subscribe to stay connected. May this be a reminder. Your story has power too.